Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Heiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together. And today we are going to be talking about why the four asteroid goddesses should be treated the same as planets when you're using them in your natal astrology readings. So, hi, Lori. My name's Alicia
Hi,
Heiser, and this is Lori
I'm
Kaufman.
Lori Kaufman. Yes.
Who are the asteroid goddesses?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Um, so Pallas Athena is the one that I've always felt closest to. And then we have Juno, we have Ceres, and we have Vesta.
We do. And the asteroids were discovered in the 1800s, was the first one discovered, which is
Mhm.
Ceres. And they're physically located in the sky between Mars and Jupiter.
Most of them.
And most of them, yes.
Some of them aren't.
The asteroid belt is.
Yes, yes.
And there are over 2 million asteroids at this point that have been discovered.
Mhm.
And the way that they are named is when an astronomer discovers an asteroid, they're given the privilege of naming it. And so there's about 28,000 named asteroids, and there's more being named every day. And they're named everything from beer to George to Pallas Athena. And there's so many
Beer.
rabbit holes we could go down here
Nuts.
about the asteroids. But we're actually just planning on recording many, many episodes to talk about the asteroids. So this is just a brief
Yep.
overview, and we'll put a lot of info in the show notes for those of you who want to dig more into the asteroids.
I highly recommend it as a rabbit hole.
Such a good rabbit hole. And then mythically, so what the four asteroid goddesses we're talking about, right? Ceres, Juno, Vesta, and Pallas Athena were the first four asteroids named and discovered. And the thinking partially was that, we have so many male deities, right? We have Jupiter, we have Mars. We could really argue over Saturn's gender, but traditional astrology does say Saturn's a man. We have the sun, but then for female archetypes from traditional astrology, we have the moon as the mother and we have Venus as the lover. And there's really limited understandings of how you can act in a feminine way with the
Right.
traditional planets. And the asteroid goddesses, most of them are the sisters of Jupiter and Pluto and Zeus. And so they're in the same pantheon, they're the same level as the other ones, right? You have Ceres, you have Vesta, who is actually the first one born, and then the last one when, Saturn
Yeah.
ate them all. So she was the last one to come out
Ate
because
them
she was the
all,
first
put them
one
back
in.
out.
But she's the oldest. The hearth goddess is
Mhm.
the oldest, right? And then you also have Juno, who's, technically Jupiter's sister, and then Pallas Athena, who was born from Jupiter's head. But,
Yeah.
those three goddesses, besides Pallas Athena, are the sisters of Jupiter, Pluto, all of those gods. And so they should at least be treated equal to them. And that also gives you some places where you can look to dive into their mythology more if you want to learn more about them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, Yeah. So the idea that we should work with the asteroid goddesses as planets in the chart is an idea that was introduced to us by Demetra George, who is, the grandmother of asteroids. She has done so
Yeah.
much amazing research and work. Her book, Asteroid Goddesses, will be in the show notes, but this is one of the best resources you can go to learn about the asteroids. She
They're
has
facing each
done
other.
They are. She has done so much research into these four asteroid goddesses and ways that they show up in the birth chart. And she had a retreat in Palm Springs in December of 2023 that Lori and I both attended to talk about mythic asteroids. And so she talks, about way more asteroids than the four asteroid goddesses, but
Yeah.
that is kind of, the beginning of the asteroid lineage is with the goddesses. And Demetra at that retreat was saying that we should treat them as we do the planets because you don't want to put your sisters in a corner. And so we thought that was a really interesting concept to pick up, and that's why we're recording this episode.
Yeah, and when I give readings, when I first started, really, I just started noticing that, especially resources like astro.com and like places like that, always included Chiron into all of the lists. And I just remember thinking like, okay, well, I keep seeing all this stuff on these four goddesses. Why is Chiron the only one that's really ever in here? And I sought out an episode of the astrology podcast, where Demetra was talking about it, and I like this really vividly stuck with me. It was like 3 or 4 years ago. But Demetra was like rolling her eyes at Chiron, and she was just like, yeah, it's just because he's the boy. Like he is seen as this like important asteroid. And like I use Chiron a lot because I do think it's very important. He has a lot to say about your traumas and a lot of the things that you're really working towards. But really after I watched that episode, I remember like instantly putting them into my chart as like a setting, like a permanent setting, and I've used them as if they were planets ever since. And so for years they have been like such a huge part of my practice. I see them as planets anyway, and I just loved what Demetra was saying, like they are the sisters, why were they separated in the first place? And I mean, she's right. Like they shouldn't be anything different.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting point to just sit with, of why is Chiron so widely accepted in the astrological community when it seems like the asteroid goddesses have not been embraced in the same way?
I would argue that they're starting to be.
They are.
And yeah, especially with this like new age wave of more feminist astrologers or like younger astrologers, and especially as it starts to become more wider seen with women, I do feel like they're really starting to be used regularly. But typically like Chiron is the default, and then you have to like at least make some sort of clicks to at least get those four in there. And so I think that should be something that's talked about more.
Absolutely. And then to the point of using the asteroid goddesses as planets, I want to differentiate a little bit how I'm learning to work with them in charts. And I want to give Larry Arrington credit here. She is one of Kelly Surtees's TAs. She's an amazing astrologer and dancer. Her info will be in the show notes. And she was also at this retreat with Demetra. And I was talking with her about integrating the asteroid goddesses into chart work, and how she works with outer planets is because she has a Hellenistic approach, is really only when the outer planets activate a potent point in a birth chart is she then looking at them. So like my Venus, who is my chart, my ascendant ruler, because I'm a Libra rising, my Venus is conjunct Pluto. And so Pluto is absolutely very important in my birth chart. But if I didn't have any planets in aspect with Pluto, if Pluto wasn't really doing anything prominent in my chart, then from a Hellenistic perspective, you wouldn't use Pluto at all.
Pluto
but
wouldn't either.
Pluto has a lot to offer.
Pluto wasn't invented yet.
Pluto has a lot to offer, and definitely, even for people mainly steeped in traditional astrology, great to integrate with. But there is a difference that the visible planets all rule astrology, all rule zodiac signs. And from a Hellenistic perspective, the planet that rules a zodiac sign and rules a house is so important. And so, we can have conversations about, well, does Pluto rule Scorpio? But, the techniques that I've been taught, the techniques I use Mars as the ruler of Scorpio, Jupiter as the ruler of Pisces, and Saturn as the ruler of Aquarius. And that gives the visible planets a much more potent role in the chart of they're in charge of really important life topics for us. And they're in charge of bringing things forth in our lives in a way that Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto aren't, with that same nuance. And so I would argue, everyone should work with asteroids however feels intuitive for them. Like there's no right or wrong answer here at all. And there's so much fun experimentation to be done as well, of just figuring out what flows and works well. But where I'm going to be starting with, integrating like using the asteroids as planets in my chart work and all of that is looking at them the same way and treating them the same way as I would, Pluto is literally Ceres and Juno and Vesta's brother, right? So why not treat them the same? But then in that way, Jupiter is actually treated slightly different because Jupiter rules Pisces and Sagittarius.
Yeah, and just like leaning into that, I got my start in modern astrology and ended up the more I learned, the more I understood. We've been kind of talking about this, but modern astrology is mostly backed in psychology, and I think we're going to make another episode on that. But the more I learned about astrology as a whole, I started realizing that there's more validity in Hellenistic approaches. And so I started kind of changing over my approach to reading. But I learned with the outer planets being just as important as the inner planets. And that never sat right with me fully, but that was the way that I learned. So that's kind of just the way I took it. And so now I kind of take a similar approach, but I always do look at them. And every planet is like basically angular or doing something important in my chart. I don't really have any planets that kind of stand out or aren't like in the midst of everything else going on. So for me personally, that wasn't really like ever an option. But the asteroids, except for Ceres, are all very prominent and angular in my chart too. So yeah, they just always felt important. And I would also add to, when you're looking at asteroids that are not the goddesses, you really only want to look at like a 2 to 3 degree orb, and really just conjunctions, because if they're outside of that, like there's too many asteroids. Like you can make too many arguments about too many things. And so I would really only see or hold a whole lot of validity in like a asteroid being like 2 degrees off your sun, or like moon or rising, or Venus, or your angles, or something like that. Something conjunct Pluto, I mean, if it's like a friend's name or like something, then it's kind of funny, but it's not like a like super prominent thing, I would argue. But then when it comes to the actual goddesses, I still use the like 8 to almost 10 degree orb. And I still take conjunctions over anything, but I would say like I look at other aspects with these. So I use them just as I would use the outer planets, which is like slightly below the visible planets. So just kind of what you were saying, but like I give them almost like a little more.
Yeah.
But I use them in every reading always. Like I pay attention to everything, and then I really just focus on what feels the most important anyway. So sometimes like Ceres for me is not really doing a whole lot in my chart. So if I was giving myself a reading, I wouldn't really talk about her,
And there was a point you made in there that I want to pull out to make sure everyone understands it. When you said, maybe if your friend's name is conjunct Pluto or something, the asteroids, because there's 28,000 named asteroids, many of them have people's names.
Human names.
And the example that Demetra always uses is King Charles has the asteroids Camilla and Parks conjunct his Venus.
Yeah.
And so there's things like that will show up, and it can be really fun to look up. Like there's no Alicia asteroid, but there's an Alicia Claire, and it's on my friend's ascendant, so it can be fun to see things like that, of ways that things can show up. And I guess,
and not every
ahead.
name has an asteroid. It's just what I was gonna say. Like, and I really liked what Demetra was saying about how you can use the feminine or the masculine versions. So somebody named Robert, if you can't find Robert but you found Roberta, then use Roberta, because Robert could have Roberta conjunct his ascendant, and that's the same thing. That it's like equal validity basically at that point. And so I've definitely seen things like that play out. My name also doesn't have an asteroid, but there are many different versions of my name and spellings of my name, and some of those do. So I've looked up all of them. And sometimes they look prominent and sometimes they don't. And But I've heard a lot of stories of people having their partner's name like right on their descendant or on their Venus or their sometimes ascendant or something like that too. So yeah, and that'll tell part of the story.
Yeah.
And
And
you can look up
then
anybody's name. It's fun.
it's
A
really
rabbit hole.
fun. Asteroids are such a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
And then to talk about orbs and aspects with how I use asteroids, which again, as I already said, like this is all experimental. We're all figuring out how this works and shows up in the charts.
Yeah.
Right. Asteroids were only starting to be discovered about 200 years ago. There's not a lot of technique that's been formulated around them. And so you'll see that Lori and I have slightly different techniques that we use because we just have different approaches to astrology, and whatever technique or approach feels resonant for you in your practice, and when you're looking at your own charts or however you work with astrology, go with that.
Yeah. Whatever feels right.
Exactly. And for me, for orbs, being taught by Kelly Surtees, she uses really, really tight orbs. And so I tend to not look at more than 3 to 5 degrees, especially with the asteroids. If it was more than a 3-degree conjunction, even with the goddesses, like maybe a 5-degree, especially if it's applying, because applying aspects are stronger than separating. If it's the moon, I might give a wider orb, because the moon can move up to, I believe, 13 degrees a day. But I'm using pretty tight orbs usually with asteroids. I'm not using like co-presence or, like I have a million asteroids in my first house, and most of them are like 20 degrees away from my ascendant. But then Ceres is on my ascendant. So she's the one who I find more significant, even though my other asteroids are in the same sign, they're just not very close. And so I use pretty tight orbs with the asteroids, and I haven't fully figured out what aspects yet, but I believe witnessing Demetra's work, she mainly works with conjunctions and then sometimes oppositions to the luminaries. Which is also an important distinction of when an asteroid is in aspect to your sun, moon, or rising. It's going to have a much broader impact on your life and chart as a whole, because those are, the points that have to do with you, yourself, your personality, your body. And so it's going to be a more universal impact when an asteroid is aspecting those, points in the sky. Whereas if an asteroid's aspecting your Mars and that's the ruler of your descendant, then it might be more topically showing up related to relationships and like your Mars topics. But I haven't fully figured out what aspects I want to be working with asteroids. I'm mainly focused on conjunctions now, but that's just something I'm really looking forward to experimenting in my practice. Actually, is like, does having a trine to Ceres have a significant impact in people's lives? Who knows?
And I've I think Demetra actually even mentions this in her Asteroid Goddesses book, but she was talking about how somebody had, I believe it was Pluto square Ceres in their chart, and they lost a child, or had like or maybe not even like fully lost, but even just divorce, and then there was like a bad battle for the child or something, things like that, where just topics of loss happened because it was like a tight square. So I would argue that like sometimes I look at things like that, like, because going into that, like I do use the asteroids very, very frequently. I keep the aspects off when I use astro.com, because if you turn on the aspects, it's just chaos. It just looks like a lot. I do keep them on for Chiron, and something that I talk about a lot, not that we're really talking about Chiron right now, maybe he can have his own episode, but for almost 20 years, it seemed like in the 80s and 90s, Chiron and Saturn were moving like opposite each other for a very long time. And so a lot of us actually have that opposition. And if you don't have the opposition, then it's like just a few degrees off of being opposite. And so that's something that I think about a lot, because that can just indicate like daddy issues or issues with authority figures. And something that I've just found really interesting watching all of our generation go through our Saturn return, and then like quitting our jobs and like doing things on our own. That just felt really strong, like such a like Saturn opposite Chiron thing. And like my Chiron is completely alone, so being opposite Saturn is really the only thing it's doing in my chart. I think it's like squaring Pluto, but that's like it. So yeah, I mean, I would argue that sometimes that is really prominent, and you can always talk about the asteroids either way.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I don't always look at aspects. I keep them in mind, and if I see something that looks striking or worth saying, but I think that's also like a completely different argument of like, how do you know where to even start when you're reading a birth chart? Because you're going to want to get out the most important things to people. And I do take on full-time clients. And with those people, I will sit down and be like, okay, here's every single detail of your chart. Like,
Mhm.
let's really break into this. Let's really break this down and like work together to like solve this big problem and like dig so deep into all of the aspects. But when I'm giving most readings, I let them pick the time, but typically you only have between an hour and 4. And like if a asteroid isn't making like a really clear aspect, or it's not within 3 degrees, or it's like not doing a whole lot, like you're not going to talk about it. There's not time to talk about it.
Mhm.
So that's kind of just it's almost like the art of like, well, what's most important? Like,
Yeah.
let's look for the thing that seems to be the loudest, right? Like,
Mhm.
what's the loudest part of your chart? Because sometimes, like for me, it's not Ceres. Like, I have her, but it's not her, you know?
Mhm.
So
Well,
I
and
think there's a lot of different ways to look at it.
there's a piece there too of this being it's the art of astrology. This is
Right.
intuitive as
The
well. And
language.
that was really interesting being at the Mythic Asteroids retreat with Demetra George earlier
Yeah.
this month, because she's also done so much work translating Hellenistic astrological doctrine and teaching that doctrine, which is generally very strict and pretty mathematical and formulaic.
Right.
Whereas, she got her start in her career working with the asteroids like in the 70s and 80s, and is now coming back to it. And it's a much more intuitive approach, like asking
Yeah.
Demetra these questions of like, well, what orbs do you use? What aspects, what about these technical things? And there's not a hard and fast rule for it. It's just when you look at someone's
Right.
chart and you feel like, oh, I'm really feeling pulled to the Ceres aspect, or what
Yeah.
Vesta's doing here, or like I'm not really seeing any of the goddesses showing up, so I'm not going to talk about them in this reading. But it is quite intuitive. And again, as I've said a
Mhm.
couple times in this session already, it's a practice that's being built, right? Like we're figuring
Yeah.
out what the technique and what the theory actually are and applying it,
Sure.
which is really fun.
And I think Hellenistic astrology, like when you think about it, it's like the first thing. Like all
Mhm.
they had back then was to look up at the sky and try to create meaning. Um, so Hellenistic astrology has been tried and proven and tested and created for so long. It's had so much time to really like develop its space and its art and its freedoms and like the way that it's seen and used in the world. And the asteroids haven't been given that, especially the goddesses, like enough people are starting to use them now. And I love that, like even in the honeycomb planners, like there's an option to add them, and like, like they are becoming a little more well received. But they aren't as tried and true as like Saturn or
Mhm.
like the sun, or like the meanings, the traditional meanings, and the timing techniques and the math and the science that's really gone into hundreds and hundreds of years of like creating the language of astrology. Like the asteroids are too new for that, especially the like 28,000 other ones that we're now finding. It's like, well, like just Google all the names of your friends, or like, just things like that. Like it's just fun. It's almost like a game, and you can just look up any mythic story that you relate to and see why you might relate to it. And even just at the asteroid retreat, as Demetra was talking, anytime she would talk about an asteroid that I was like, oh, I resonate with this story, it was always like 2 degrees off my sun, or the exact degree of my sun, or conjunct my moon, or like I just
Mhm.
kept finding it over and over and over. When she was talking about Circe, it was the same degree as my sun, and I went and instantly bought the book because I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna go learn about Circe now. Like, it's just things like that. where I think they can just give you so much insight to yourself.
Mhm.
And just other pieces, but like, you know, there's so many of them that you have to just see what resonates and take it with a grain of salt and play around with it and
Mhm.
find these funny stories for yourself. And I'm sure we'll do many episodes. We plan to bring on some people that we met at the retreat, and have them tell their stories, and we have many stories. But there's
Yeah.
just so many different ways I think you can use them.
And
And yeah, go ahead.
and that storytelling aspect, I think, is so important to
Yes.
sit with, that really, like, that's the dimension that the asteroids bring in, um,
Sure.
is that storytelling aspect of, if I have Ceres on my ascendant, I am living the mythology of Ceres. I'm living the, like,
Right.
Ceres, Persephone. I also have a significant Pluto. Mercury's there, who's involved in the myth, and Adonis,
Right.
who was, Persephone's lover. So, like, that underworld mythology is the mythology that I am living out, right? And so
Yeah.
knowing what your story is and how you fit into these mythic stories, the asteroids can really help connect us to it. And back to that more kind of intuitive approach to reading astrology that's different from the Hellenistic approach is, yeah, it is, like, what is your story?
Right.
What are you feeling and how you live out your life? And that opens up so much exciting opportunity for better understanding yourself, better understanding how you fit within the whole.
Yeah.
Stories are ancient. We've had
Yeah.
oral tradition much longer than we've had the written word.
Right.
It's a way that is really resonant for humans to connect to stories.
Yeah.
And that's a really exciting thing about working with the asteroids.
And two things to add with that. The first thing is the like just unreliable narrator
Mhm.
theory. Because you know, these stories were originally told, but like then they were retold and retold and retold. And you know, there's versions of the Persephone myth where she's raped and stolen and brought down to the underworld. And then there's versions where she just chooses to marry Hades, you know,
Mhm.
and like she just wanted to be there. And so I do think like, you know, those are two completely different stories. So which is true. And it's like, well, which one do you resonate with? You know? And so as you like look into these stories, I think they can really play things out. Um and just I'll give like a funny story to what you were saying about Persephone, Demeter, and Hades. You can really look into other people's charts to kind of see how they play into each other.
Mhm.
I My boyfriend is in Antarctica, and when we first started dating, I just kept feeling like I was getting a lot of Persephone and Demeter like energy all over the place. I pulled the High Priestess the day I met him. Like it just there were so many weird coincidences I kept finding, and finally I looked into it. And Demeter in my chart, not Ceres, but Demeter is at the exact degree of Persephone in his chart, both in Scorpio in my 5th house, which is dating and partnerships. And I have his name, Alex, conjunct my Pluto, also
Mm.
in my 5th house in Scorpio. So that was just one of those things where I was like, I feel like we're playing out this story where I'm just like sitting here and he's gone for the winter in the underworld, literally Antarctica. And then
Mhm.
he comes back to summertime here.
Mhm.
So, you know, like even just things like that where it's like, oh my God, this is so stupid. But like how do you fight that? You know, like how do you argue that? Because they were the same degree.
Mhm.
It's so funny. And yeah, his name is just like 2 degrees off of Pluto for me. So
In your fifth
um
house, and you're dating him.
in my 5th house. Right,
Yeah.
right. So it's just like it's things like that, where you find these stories and you're just like, okay, why am I living this story right now? Like
Mhm.
the here it is, like literally playing out in your life. And I think that's like that was just one of those moments where I was like, all right, well, here's the mythology playing out. Like, you know, just like when you really deep dive into these stories and into these asteroids, like it's so stupid and so crazy how
It's
it like
so
just
crazy.
it just works and it just
Yeah.
is. And then and it teaches you something, you know, it's like, okay, well, it's here for a reason.
Mhm. And,
Yeah.
the way I've experienced the asteroids too is because obviously, like, we don't all know all the asteroids in our charts because there's millions of them, 28,000 named
Right.
asteroids. And I will also put in the show notes a link to a
Mhm.
website where you can go look up asteroids if you're sitting here wondering, how do I look this up? Because you can use
Yeah.
astro.com, but Demetra also gave us a website
Yeah.
where you can look up specific asteroids in your chart. So that'll be in the show notes for people who want to dive down the rabbit hole. But
Mhm.
yeah, I actually just completely lost my train of thought when I said that. So that's
Yeah. Well,
funny.
just to play into the astro.com thing, you can Google the name of the asteroid. So like, let's say I wanted to look up my own name. I could Google Lori and then asteroid number. And then if there is an asteroid with my name, it'll pop up with like a random number. And then you can copy paste that number into astro.com, or you can like click on the list and look through alphabetical order and see if your name exists in there. Or any name, really. It could be any mythical creature or whatever. But if you want to just Google it, it'll just give you a pretty simple, easy number, and then you can just copy paste it right into the little box and it'll just show it to you. So I think
Awesome.
astro.com is the easiest free resource that you can find for it.
Absolutely. So those are really good resources. We wanted to talk a little bit. We both have been working through this book, Lost Goddesses of Early
Yes.
Greece by Charlene Spretnik, which is an excellent resource that will also be in the show notes.
Yeah.
I highly recommend it. And one point, too, back to the argument of why the 4 asteroid goddesses should be treated the same as planets in a birth chart. And just to really clarify that we are differentiating between the first 4 asteroid goddesses who were discovered and named, and those are, Ceres, Juno, Vesta, and Pallas Athena. We're treating those differently than the other 28,000 asteroids. And that might feel a little confusing because we've been talking about both in this episode, because we're also talking about how to work with the asteroids generally. But it's really the 4 asteroid goddesses that are the ones who are like so important, so prominent to put them on the level of outer planets, at least in my practice. I don't know, Lori, would you agree with that you put them on a different level than the other asteroids?
Oh,
Cool.
yeah.
And then
I
this,
use them as planets.
yeah. And then this book it doesn't have, I think Vesta's not in here, but the other 3 asteroid goddesses
Yeah,
are,
one of them's
and it's
not.
Greece. So it's Demeter and Pallas and Hera instead of Juno, but
Sure,
they're
sure.
very similar gods. And she talks a lot
Yeah.
about kind of the history of how these goddesses came into the Olympic pantheon, but the fact that most of these goddesses are actually much more ancient than the Olympic pantheon. And when you look at the
Yeah.
history of colonization in the Greek islands, you see many instances of these much more ancient matrilineal goddess worship groups of people who would, be organized around Ceres or Demeter, the
Right.
grain goddess, the earth goddess mother, or peoples who were oriented around Vesta, Hestia, the hearth goddess. And like with Demeter, she was her own goddess before she ever became Zeus's sister. Like she's the ancient grain mother. Like she is
Yeah.
so much older than Zeus. And what you see the Zeus worshiping barbarians and these northern cults and tribes coming in and invading these more matrilineal peoples and dominating them and colonizing them. And then you see how the mythology changes. And so when, Lori was talking about the Persephone myth and how there's older versions where Persephone chooses to go to the underworld. And the
Yeah.
rape of Persephone is a much later addition to that mythology that you could use to understand the way that the people who worshipped Persephone and Demeter were colonized and dominated by the Zeus worshippers. And that's its own episode. That would be a really interesting rabbit hole to go down. But all that to
Yeah,
say that,
absolutely.
myth and story also show how people's experiences change over time, and they can capture historical events in those stories as well. And, people like Charlene and Demetra George have been doing really important feminist research of recovering these older versions of the goddesses and older understandings of them. And this book is a
Yeah.
great resource to learn more about that. She has she has a myth of Demeter and Persephone that you can read, of Persephone choosing to go to the underworld. She has all these kind of rewritten, reimagined versions of the myth. But just to highlight that these goddesses are ancient, so they absolutely should be on the
Right.
same level, if not their own level, of like Zeus and Jupiter and Pluto and the other gods, because these goddesses are they were their own goddesses before they became the sisters of the other gods.
Sure. And I do think that kind of leans into the matriarchy versus patriarchy conversation as well, and like the silencing of women. And I marked off this one quote that I really
Yeah.
it hit me pretty hard while I was reading this last night. I was trying to like absorb as much to get ready for this. But it was really talking about how these goddesses were like older than the others, but now these prototypes, it says, later evolved into the wicked witch, the cruel stepmother, the passive princess, in all of our like fairy tales. And it's basically just like making this argument that like what used to be this like goddess, beautiful, like worshiping energy, in more of like a modern society has almost adopted this like archetype of the wicked witch and the evil stepmother. And you know, all of these, like, I even think of like Disney movies, you know, like the evil stepsisters and the evil stepmother and like the wicked witch, and you know, just like all of those movies that really like hit that point home of
Mm-hmm.
like these evil women just being the bad guys, and all of these archetypes that just like stem from these original goddesses who were goddesses. And yeah, I think that's like really interesting to dig into as well. Like, how did we get so lost in translation that we started with a goddess and like ended up here?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I think there's so much to be said, which maybe could be another episode. But I remember at Norwalk a couple of years ago, I think it was Rick Levine gave a lecture talking about how each of the planets like modernized
Mm-hmm.
in their meaning throughout history, because you know, like, we change, we absorb, and our realities change. You know, we're not living the same reality as somebody who lived hundreds of years ago. Like, they didn't have these microphones, they didn't have podcasts. Like, we're not doing the same things. So a lot of the archetypes that were assigned to certain planets, once the more modern, farther away planets, you know, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, were found, and the asteroids were found, like a lot of the meanings that used to be Saturn's went to them. And I think that's like, that's something I think about a lot, is like Saturn used to be the final planet. It used to be doom and gloom and death and like scarier things and all of the like darkness. But now we have other planets, you know, like we've found Uranus, and then it was like, oh, that's the scary planet. But then we found Neptune, and it was like, oh, wait, that's the scary planet. And then we found Pluto, and it was like, wait, that's the scary planet. And it's like, well, you know, maybe none of them are really the scary planet. Like, maybe they all can have a little bit of death and rebirth energy to them. But like, you know, how much of Saturn's energy has changed in modern astrology when it's no longer death and like lessons. Um, and so I think the same can be said about these myths, and the same can be said about like so many different things about getting lost in translation, but also like how we as a society change, how we as women change, how we as just like humans change. Like, you know, our technology is always different. The things around us are always different. There's so much, even just daily, that's shifting over. And so these archetypes really change and evolve and almost like adopt new life and meaning as we shift. And you know, I could talk so much about that, so we could do a whole nother episode on that. But
Absolutely.
yeah, that was just something that really hit me as I was reading this, is just like, you know, how did we get so lost in translation that we ended up from point A to point B? And you know, I think about that with every planet, you know, how traditionally, and I think that post-colonial astrology book does a really good job of talking about that
Mm-hmm.
too.
Alice Sparkley Cat's Post-Colonial Astrology is an
Absolutely.
amazing book.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
really enjoyed
so
that one.
so much like
Yeah.
richness in everything you just said, and so much
Yeah.
nuance. And what I'm
Right.
really thinking about, so Michael J. Morris is another one of Kelly Surtees's TAs and an incredible astrologer and someone who's
Mhm.
been doing a lot of work with the asteroid goddesses as well.
Mhm.
And this is actually a quote from an episode they did on the astrology podcast about
Yeah.
transgender experiences in astrology. So not their asteroid goddess one, but they talk about how the charts we read, the things we look at show what
Mhm.
we value as a society. And so if we're not reading trans charts, for an example, then are we recognizing, the existence and dignity of trans people as astrologers? And that's really what I'm thinking about with what you're saying here of,
Mhm.
recognizing this misogynistic legacy of astrology, right? Like I practice
Yeah.
Hellenistic astrology, and the people who were creating that doctrine were not creating it for me, and
Right.
like
Right.
we started this episode saying that the, feminine energies available to us through traditional astrology are the mother and the lover, right? And there's a lot that we could
Right.
say about all
Yeah.
of that.
There's no other option.
But
Maybe
that
the sister, which was also
exactly.
Venus.
Exactly, literally.
Yeah,
Um
these archetypes.
And that's what
Yeah.
we've inherited. And it's so important for us to recognize where we've come from and really understand where we've come from. But also, we are creating
Yeah.
the world that we want to live in. And we can create a world in
Mhm.
which that is not what we're supporting and upholding. And the way we practice
Yeah.
astrology, the way we talk about gender and our experiences, and, so many more nuances. Um, really matters and really plays a part in creating the world that we live in. And so that is a really exciting thing to me about the asteroid goddesses, about working
Yeah.
with them in the chart, is it opens up, the way that Pallas Athena relates to her femininity and like her athleticism and her intelligence is very different than the way
Yeah.
Ceres, nurtures all life and brings unconditional love forth, and like some of us are going to
Yes.
embody different archetypes at different times in our lives in different ways. Also, we all have feminine and masculine energy within us. This transcends way beyond like what your
Right.
physical anatomy or assigned gender or any of that is. These are all like
Right.
energies and archetypes that we are all living out all the time. And
Right.
being intentional about how we work with these energies and what type of world we want to live in and how we're creating that world is very important in how we practice
Yeah.
astrology.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I have a very masculine heavy chart. Like, I don't have like any feminine qualities really in my chart except for
You
my
have Venus
Venus.
in Pisces.
That's it. She's struggling.
She's like squeezed between all that Aries Aquarius energy.
She's stuck.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, even just the more you look into things like that, it's like, well, that's something I've thought about a lot. I'm not the most feminine person, and um, and I feel like we kind of have a societal norm that you have to be like a certain way, and some people's charts say you're not like that, and when I was going through Demetra's textbook, the first one, there was an activity that I laughed at that she had you like depict your whole chart in the like feminine or masculine energies, and Venus was the only feminine energy I had in my whole chart. And I was just laughing at it like, oops. Like my Venus is just sitting there alone. um but it really goes into that conversation of gender norms, and just, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. That
Totally.
could be a whole
We
lot of
could do like
conversations too, but
a whole season of episodes talking about that if we wanted to go down that rabbit hole.
I was gonna say that's a whole other rabbit hole probably, but
There's a lot of rabbit
yeah,
holes
I
with
mean,
the asteroids, as
yeah.
I'm sure you've gathered. um
Yes.
Well, that's most of everything that we had to talk about. We were actually originally going to split this into 2 episodes, and then it just kind of organically
Mm-hmm.
flowed out all in one. So here we are.
Yeah, I think
Are there any
this
other
worked out.
perfect? Are there any other thoughts or anything that you wanted to share before we wrap up, Lori?
I don't think so. I think we really covered most of what we wanted to. Is there any like special offerings or anything you have going on right now?
Yeah, so I offer herbal astrology readings. I'm an herbalist as well as an astrologer. And so you can get an astrology reading with me where we talk about life topics that are important to you. And I will come up with some herbal and lifestyle recommendations based off of, what elements are really prominent in your chart, how to help,
Mm-hmm.
planets that might be struggling out, how to help with priorities or things important to you. I can recommend herbs that might be good to work with. I can recommend, different lifestyle practices as well. And I also make astrologically personalized herbal teas where I look at your birth chart and consider your temperament and elemental makeup as well. And any priorities or things like, oh, I'm having trouble sleeping, or I want something to help me focus. And then I can put together a tea focused on what you're looking to get out of it. And so both of those can be
Yeah.
found on my website, which is aliciacielle.com, which will be in the show notes. And I'm also over on Instagram at Alicia Cielle, so you can follow me over there. What about you, Lori?
Yeah. Yeah. I just going into the elements thing, I just recently gave a pretty big lecture on the elements. It's almost an hour long. So I'm selling that currently for $10. And I'm doing little written reports on your personal elements to go with it. So like lack, abundance, all that stuff. We'll probably do an episode on that here too. But if you were curious about that, feel free to shoot me a message. My website is LoriKaufman27.com and my Instagram is LoriK_127. I am still offering my year in review for 2024 readings. So I'll probably discount those in the new year. So if you want one, it's not too late. We can go backwards. And I'm just trying to think. I still have my tarot school recordings if anybody wants to learn tarot, and I'm doing a lot of offerings right now. I'm taking on full-time clients for starting in January. So if you wanted to either learn astrology from me or like use it for almost like a alternative therapy type thing, or life coaching or whatever you're looking to use it for, I will accept that. I'm also writing a book and creating an oracle deck on the asteroids. So if you have any personal stories or anything you wanted to add to that, I am starting to kind of put out that I am taking those. So if you want to reach out just to chat about that too, or send me your stories, I would love to add them because I'm starting to collect them for my second book. So yeah,
Send her your
that's about
stories.
all
Send
I've got.
us your stories. We
Yes,
definitely want to do more
yes,
episodes
we want to
talking
do
about
more of
chart
that.
examples and how the asteroids really show
Yes.
up in our lives. And so if you have
Mm-hmm.
any examples that you'd like to share with us, we would love to hear
Yeah.
from you.
Yeah, we will definitely do more of that as we go. The asteroids are definitely a niche that I've really felt called to. So, and I'm offering asteroid readings now too.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if you are, but if you wanted to deep dive into the asteroids with somebody who can help you, we're both willing to help you. So feel free to reach
Absolutely.
out about that too.
I
Yeah.
don't have a formal asteroid reading listed on my website right now, but if you want to talk about asteroids, you can just put that in the notes and we can focus on that in a reading. And I am
Yeah.
planning on revamping how I structure my readings in 2024, and there will be a specific asteroid goddess, or not asteroid goddess, but mythic asteroids reading that will be an option for people at that time. But until then, I I will still talk about asteroids with you in a regular reading.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll be back with plenty of more information about the asteroids soon.
Yeah.